When the Sex Pistols roared in London and the Ramones shook New York, the world thought punk rock was born. They were wrong. Before all that chaos in a forgotten rusting city in America, a secret architect had already drawn up the blueprint. His name was Peter Laughner. This is the story of the genius ghost who created a musical revolution, only to be erased by it. This is not an act of remembrance. This is an autopsy of a buried legend's tragedy, a search for the music squeezed from the line between genius and hell. And to conduct that autopsy, we must begin where the first crack appeared, not in his soul, but on the map of the America where he was raised. To understand the storm inside Peter Laughner, one must first understand the seismic fault line he has walked every day of his short life. He is not just the product of a town or a city, but of the constant collision between two opposing versions of the American dream. Two parallel worlds that exist only a few miles apart, but are as distant as two different planets. The first America was his birthplace in 1952, Bay Village, Ohio. The second was the one that would swallow and shape his soul. From the outside, it was picture perfect. Nestled on the wind-swept shores of Lake Erie, just west of Cleveland, Bay Village was the epitome of post-war prosperity and optimism. It was a world built on stability, of sturdy brick homes on manicured lots. The atmosphere here seemed woven of quiet contentment and middle-class aspiration. A good education at a prestigious school, a respectable career, a stable family, and a routine, predictable life. This was a world of weekend barbecues, of shiny cars in the garage, and of a kind of invisible but powerful social norm where differences were discouraged. The road ahead seemed to be paved, a straight path to a safe, comfortable future. But Peter, even as a child, felt like a stranger on that road. He was an overly sensitive child, a natural observer whose eyes seemed to see through the veneer of perfection. His home life, while not one of outright tragedy, was a land of quiet complications. It was a typical middle-class family where facades were carefully maintained, but beneath the surface were undercurrents of discontent and unspoken conflict. Peter learned to read between the lines, sense the tension in the silences, and recognize the discord behind his parents' smiles. This sense of isolation didn't just persist at school, where he was an overweight asthmatic boy who never fit in. It seeped into his home, instilling in him a permanent sense of being an outsider. The family culture, like many of its time, normalized the presence of alcohol. It wasn't a hidden vice, but a part of social gatherings, a lubricant for awkward interactions. For a young soul looking for escape, this inadvertently removed all barriers and stigmas around a substance that would become his primary means of escape from reality. Bay Village gave Peter a home, but not a sanctuary. It taught him order but left him craving chaos. And that chaos awaited him just east. In 1970s Cleveland. If Bay Village was the promise, Cleveland was its decaying corpse. Once the workshop of the world, it was now a landscape of rusting steel nicknamed the Mistake on the Lake, a city whose river had literally caught fire from pollution. It was in this crucible of decay and irony that Peter Laughner found his true home and his voice, caught in the unbearable voltage between the sterile suburbs and the beautiful ruins of the city. And so he began the arduous task of building a third world for himself, a world of purpose made from the fragments of the two random worlds he had been thrown into. It would be built not of bricks and steel, but of the pages of Kerouac, the distorted chords of the Velvet Underground, and the haunting noise he was about to make. He had found his battlefield, and his weapon would be a guitar. But a warrior cannot go to battle with a weapon alone. He needs a philosophy, a blueprint for the war he is about to wage, and he would find it not in a classroom, but in the rebellion of the printed page and the grooves of a vinyl record. Trapped in the cross-current between the suffocating politeness of the suburbs and the beautiful, terrifying decay of the city, Peter Laughner began the arduous task of self-creation. He belonged to neither world, so he resolved to build a third. This new reality would not be accidental. It would be intentional, painstakingly assembled from the discarded fragments of art, literature, and sound that the mainstream world had deemed too difficult, too dark, or too dangerous. His bedroom in Bay Village, Ohio, became a laboratory, an insurgency of one, where he began to draw up the blueprints for his escape. The foundational texts for this new world were not found in his high school curriculum. He discovered them in the raw, rebellious prose of the Beat generation. He devoured the works of Jack Kerouac, not for the romanticized tales of cross-country road trips, but for the almost spiritual quest for ecstatic experience, for a truth that could only be found on the fringes of society. From William S. Burroughs, he learned a more radical lesson, that art could be assembled from the chaos of a broken world. Burroughs' hallucinatory, cut-up visions taught him that there was a jagged logic and a strange beauty to be found in deconstruction. These writers weren't just telling stories, they were providing a manual for a different way of being, a life lived in fierce opposition to the accidental reality he felt was closing in on him. This was a solitary education, conducted under the glow of a bedside lamp late into the night, while his peers were navigating the predictable rituals of suburban adolescence. Peter was communing with the ghosts of artistic rebellion, absorbing their language and their ethos. He was building his intellectual armor, preparing for a war that, for now, was being waged entirely inside his own head. But a blueprint is useless without a soundtrack. The music that would give voice to his internal world arrived like a shockwave, crackling through the airwaves from distant, impossibly cool cities like Detroit and New York. He discovered the holy trinity of what would become proto-punk, three distinct sounds that would form the pillars of his own artistic identity. The music that would give voice to his internal world arrived like a shockwave. He discovered the holy trinity of proto-punk, the primal, violent howl of the Stooges from industrial Michigan, the street-smart, glam nihilism of the New York Dolls, and most importantly, the Velvet Underground. In the dark, literary poetry of Lou Reed, Peter found his ultimate avatar. The Velvets proved that rock and roll could be as intellectually deep and emotionally complex as a novel, validating his belief that this loud, visceral music could contain the whole of human experience. This education demanded participation. Listening wasn't enough. He had to learn the language. He painstakingly taught himself guitar, not through formal lessons, but through the solitary devotional act of dropping a needle onto a record, listening intently, and mimicking the sounds over and over until his fingers could replicate the vocabulary of his heroes. This process wasn't just technical, it was an act of communion. He wasn't just learning chords, he was internalizing a philosophy. This private world eventually had to be made public. He formed his first real band, a folk rock group called Mr. Charlie, and began to play out. It was a monumental step, a formal declaration of intent, a clear signal that he was leaving the accidental reality behind to join the intentional world of art. As he immersed himself deeper in the Cleveland scene, he found another way to join the conversation. He began writing freelance music reviews for Cream, the brash, irreverent Detroit-based magazine that was the true Bible for rock and roll fans who found Rolling Stone too tame. This connection led him to his most important intellectual relationship, a correspondence, and later a deep friendship with the magazine's star writer, the legendary Lester Bangs. Bangs was more than a journalist. He was a rock and roll philosopher, a manic prophet whose raw gonzo energy mirrored the chaos of the music he loved. To the mainstream, he was the rebellious critic later immortalized in the film Almost Famous. To Peter, he was a hero. Here was a man who took this music as seriously as he did, who understood that a 3-minute punk song could contain more truth than a library of novels. Their friendship was a meeting of two deeply romantic, almost tragically poetic minds. Bang saw in Peter a younger, perhaps even purer version of himself, awed by his talent and encyclopedic knowledge. For Peter, the friendship was the ultimate validation. It confirmed he was not alone in his crusade. But this mentorship was a double-edged sword. Bangs himself was a man who wrestled with his own demons, who lived the rock and roll lifestyle as much as he wrote about it. In him, Peter found not only an intellectual guide, but also a role model for a life lived at full volume, a life that dangerously blurred the lines between creation and self-destruction. The friendship was a profound source of encouragement, but it also reinforced the very romantic myths that would eventually lead him down such a dark path. Still, myths and long-distance friendships could not build a band. The books, the records, and the letters were the foundation, but to truly build his new world, Peter needed collaborators who breathed the same polluted Cleveland air. He needed to find his accomplices. The intellectual and artistic worlds Peter Laughner had built in the solitude of his bedroom were no longer enough. The books, the records, and the long-distance validation from his hero Lester Bangs had provided a blueprint and a philosophy, but a revolution cannot be fought alone. To wage his war against the accidental reality, Peter needed accomplices. He needed to translate the noise in his head into a sound the world could hear. Back in the gritty post-industrial landscape of Cleveland, his intense energy and musical talent were becoming a magnetic force, and he began to draw other outsiders into his orbit. Around 1974, he connected with the one person in the city whose artistic vision was as strange, ambitious, and uncompromising as his own. A hulking, intensely intelligent, and utterly unique vocalist and artist named David Thomas. Performing under the stage name Crocus Behemoth, Thomas was the antithesis of the stereotypical rock frontman. He was an avant-garde thinker, a connoisseur of the bizarre, his art rooted in the industrial landscapes and Midwestern weirdness that surrounded them. His powerful, unconventional voice was an instrument of astonishing range and emotion, capable of everything from a guttural bark to a desperate, warbling cry. The bond between Laughner and Thomas was immediate and electric. They were two sides of the same artistic coin, united by a shared set of esoteric influences, the absurdist rock of Captain Beefheart, the dark literature of Alfred Jarry, and a deep frustration with the limitations of conventional rock music. They saw the tension, the decay, and the dark humor of their dying city, and they believed it deserved a soundtrack that was equally confrontational, intelligent, and bizarre. They began jamming, experimenting with noise and pure energy. Soon, the idea for a new band began to form. This would not be another bar band. It would be a statement, a supergroup of the Cleveland underground. They recruited a young, ferocious guitarist in Gene O'Connor, soon to be known as Cheetah Chrome, whose raw, street-level aggression was the perfect foil for Peter's more lyrical, intricate style. They found their engine in the primal, powerful drumming of Johnny Madansky, Johnny Blitz, and an anchor in the solid melodic bass of Craig Bell. They needed a name that could capture the strange, explosive, and slightly menacing quality of their music. They found it in the title of an obscure 1950s science fiction B-movie, Rocket from the Tombs. The name was perfect. It evoked an image of something powerful and futuristic, blasting its way out of a place of death and decay, a metaphor for their own artistic ambitions within the city of Cleveland. The birth of Rocket from the Tombs was not merely the formation of another band. It was an act of aesthetic warfare. For approximately 10 months from mid-1974 to mid-1975, they blazed a fiery trail across the grimy stages of Cleveland, creating a sound that was years ahead of its time. On stage, they were a spectacle of barely controlled chaos, a five-headed beast. David Thomas was the anti-frontman, commanding the stage through sheer intellectual and vocal force. The twin guitar attack of Peter Laughner and Cheetah Chrome was the band's sonic signature, a classic rock and roll trope, reinvented as a schizophrenic dialogue. Cheetah was the raw nerve ending. His playing was a pure, snarling, slashing attack. Peter, by contrast, was the band's tormented poet. His style was more intricate, more textured, influenced by the avant-garde leanings of television's Tom Verlaine. He could unleash a squall of feedback one moment, and in the next, play a line of such delicate melodic beauty that it felt heartbreakingly fragile. The tension between these two styles created a sound that was complex and visceral, intelligent and brutal, all at once. The songs they wrote were their ammunition. Final Solution and 30 Seconds Over Tokyo were sprawling, epic pieces that fused the energy of the Stooges with a dark, literary sensibility. Ain't It Fun, penned by Peter and Cheetah, was a masterpiece of rock and roll nihilism, a taunting, sardonic sneer with its infamous, chillingly prophetic chorus. Ain't it fun when you know that you're gonna die young? Perhaps their most iconic creation was Sonic Reducer. Driven by a now legendary descending guitar riff that Peter was instrumental in arranging, the song, officially credited to bandmates Cheetah Chrome and David Thomas, was a 2.5-minute blast of adolescent frustration and amphetamine-fueled energy, culminating in the desperate cry for a sonic reducer / ain't no loser. It was the sound of a generation trying to blast its way out of the suffocating silence of its own future. Peter was a primary creative force, bringing in sophisticated chord progressions and a deep academic knowledge of rock history that elevated the band beyond simple garage rock. He was their connection to the wider world of avant-garde music, their aesthetic conscience. However, the very elements that made them so brilliant were also the seeds of their destruction. The band was a clash of massive egos and competing visions. The raw, street-level punk instincts of Cheetah Chrome and Johnny Blitz were often at odds with the more experimental art rock ambitions of Laughner and Thomas. Gigs descended into chaos, fueled by alcohol and volatile chemistry. They were a band perpetually on the verge of exploding. The end came in the summer of 1975, less than a year after they had formed. The details are the stuff of local legend. A final disastrous gig, arguments boiling over, the inevitable splintering. For Peter, the dissolution was a devastating blow. He had found the perfect vehicle for his artistic vision, a band that could contain all of his contradictions, only to watch it shatter. For him, the band was more than music. It was the ultimate antidote to the accidental reality, the one intentional world he had successfully built. Its failure wasn't just a breakup. It was a philosophical collapse. The fallout was immediate and creatively fertile, a violent schism that split the wreckage almost perfectly along its ideological fault lines. Chasing a more direct, aggressive sound, Cheetah Chrome and Johnny Blitz teamed up with singer Stiv Bators to form the Dead Boys, taking iconic songs like Sonic Reducer and riding them toward a streamlined punk rock glory in New York City. Meanwhile, Peter Laughner and David Thomas burrowed deeper into the artistic fringe, clinging to the more experimental avant-garde side of their shared vision. They regrouped to form Per Ubu. Their new project was not a concession or a compromise. It was a defiant doubling down. They named the band after the grotesque anti-hero of Alfred Jarry's surrealist play Ubu Roy, a clear signal of their anti-rock high art intentions. This was not going to be music for the masses. They famously called their sound avant-garage, a perfect descriptor for their blend of esoteric, high-minded concepts and raw, lo-fi execution. It was the sound of intellectuals slumming it in a garage, of complex ideas being hammered out with primitive tools. For a moment, it seemed as though Peter had successfully navigated the wreckage and found his true artistic home. Per Ubu's first singles, featuring the A-sides 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and Heart of Darkness, were landmark achievements in underground music. Peter's guitar work on these records is astonishing. A tense, unnerving, and brilliantly inventive performance that pushed the boundaries of what a guitar could do in a rock song. He played with a controlled chaos, weaving intricate, jagged lines through the band's industrial drone. He was in a new, groundbreaking band that he had co-founded, creating music that was even more original than his last. His ambition was firing on all cylinders. He was a crucial link between the nascent Cleveland scene and the world, championing and even helping to book New York bands like Television. He was no longer just a participant in a scene. He was becoming its architect. But this period of intense creative rebirth was running parallel to a steep and terrifying personal decline. The romantic myth of the self-destructive rock and roll poet, which he had studied in the lives of his heroes like Lou Reed and modeled in his friendship with Lester Bangs, was ceasing to be an intellectual pose. It was becoming his lived, daily reality. The pressures of his career, the lingering heartbreak of the RFTT breakup, and turmoil in his personal life were taking their toll. His use of alcohol and drugs was escalating from a habit into a full-blown dependency. This set up an impossible conflict. Per Ubu, under the pragmatic and fiercely focused leadership of David Thomas, was not a project built on chaotic energy alone. Unlike the volatile chemistry of Rocket, from the Tombs, Per Ubu was a disciplined artistic unit. They were serious about their craft and demanded commitment. For Peter, the lifestyle of excess he saw as integral to his creative identity was now a direct threat to the survival of his own creation. His bandmates watched with a growing sense of frustration and heartbreak. This was not the romantic struggle of a tortured genius. It was the painful, repetitive, and exhausting reality of dealing with addiction. Rehearsals were missed. Live performances became erratic and unpredictable, veering wildly from moments of pure, transcendent brilliance to incoherent collapse. The very person who had provided so much of the band's initial creative spark was now becoming its biggest liability. The decision they ultimately made was agonizing. In late 1976, Peter Laughner was fired from Per Ubu. For the other members, it was a brutal but necessary act of self-preservation. They saw their artistic future, a future they were building with intense seriousness, slipping away, and they made the choice to save it. For Peter, it was the ultimate wound, a public and professional excommunication. He was cast out of the musical home he had helped to build, left to stand on the outside looking in. The entire Cleveland music scene, a world he had been instrumental in creating, was now moving on without him. as Pere Ubu began the work that would lead to their seminal 1978 debut album, The Modern Dance. An album that stands as a cornerstone of post-punk, Peter was left alone, haunted by the ghost of the future that should have been his. Cast out from the very temple he had helped to build, Peter had only one place left to pour his pain, into himself. The final spiral had begun. This profound rejection sent him into a final desperate spiral. Paradoxically, this was also a period of heartbreakingly beautiful creativity. Stripped of his band and his sense of place, he turned inward, pouring his pain and disillusionment into a series of raw, intimate solo recordings. Armed with little more than an acoustic guitar and a simple tape recorder in his room, he documented his own decline with a poet's unflinching honesty. These lo-fi demos, never intended for public release, are perhaps the most essential part of his legacy. In songs like the achingly weary Amphetamine, he sang of the hollow promise of chemical escape. His voice fragile and cracking, with an almost unbearable emotional weight. His reworkings of his older songs, like Cinderella Backstreet, were transformed from swaggering rock tunes into ghostly, world-weary laments. This was the sound of a man who knew he was running out of time, a man meticulously crafting his own eulogy, one song at a time. He made a few last frantic attempts to capture the lightning of a live band, forming a short-lived group called Peter and the Wolves. But his health was rapidly deteriorating. The years of hard living had inflicted irreversible damage. Friends like his former partner, Adele Bertai, and drummer Anton Fier recall a man who was physically wasting away. A man who spoke of an early death not as a possibility, but as a destiny he was grimly determined to fulfill. Doctors gave him stark, unequivocal warnings. His pancreas and liver were failing. If he did not stop drinking immediately, he would die. He either could not or would not listen. The noise of his art was being silenced by the static of his addiction, and the final quiet tragedy was drawing near. The final scene of Peter Laughner's life was not set on a glamorous stage in New York or London, but in a place of profound and tragic irony. On June 22, 1977, in his childhood bedroom in his parents' home in Bay Village, Ohio, the very heart of the accidental reality he had spent his entire life trying to escape, his body finally gave out. The boy who had built a world of noise to drown out the suffocating quiet of the suburbs died in that very quiet. There was no rock and roll glamour in his passing. It was a lonely and painful medical event. The official cause of death was acute pancreatitis, a direct and brutal result of his alcoholism. He was 24 years old. The life had ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. His life ended in silence, but his story did not, because in the grief and guilt of a friend, a legend was about to be born from the grave. The story could have ended there, with Peter becoming just another sad footnote, a cautionary tale whispered among the musicians of a forgotten scene. But it didn't. His close friend and mentor, Lester Bangs, would not let him disappear so quietly. In a roar of guilt, grief, and furious love, Bangs wrote a sprawling, legendary eulogy titled simply, "Peter Laughner is Dead." The essay immortalized him, not as a mythical rock god, but as something more modern and tragic, the patron saint of the Rust Belt romantics, the boy who tried to build a world out of noise, only to be shattered by the sheer voltage of his own creation. Bangs ensured that Peter Laughner would not just be a casualty, he would be a legend. For decades, however, that legend was an underground one. Peter's influence was felt as an echo, a secret handshake among connoisseurs of punk and post-punk musicians and obsessive record collectors. His name was a ghost in the machine of rock history, haunting the liner notes of Pere Ubu albums and the memories of those who had witnessed the incandescent fury of Rocket from the Tombs. His work, scattered across a handful of rare singles and deteriorating bootleg tapes, was more rumor than reality. But slowly, the archaeology began. A new generation of critics and music historians, armed with the knowledge that something foundational had happened in the industrial gloom of 1970s Cleveland, started digging. But slowly, the archaeology began. A new generation of critics started digging. Over the decades, a series of crucial releases brought his work back from the dead. A 1994 compilation revealed the tormented songwriter behind the solo demos. In 2002, the definitive Rocket from the Tombs collection was unleashed, proving their legendary sound was not a myth. Finally, a comprehensive 2019 box set put the full breathtaking scope of his talent on display. Decades after his death, the apology that history owed Peter Laughner was finally being paid in full. We are still left to ask the question, what did the world lose? What would the music of the 80s and 90s, the music of bands like REM or U2, have sounded like with Peter Laughner as a living, breathing influence? How many masterpieces were left unwritten when that voice fell silent at 24? His story is a tragedy, but ultimately it is not the story of a failure. It is the story of a brilliant, condensed burst of light that burned too brightly to last. His life serves as a powerful and devastating warning about the deadly allure of romanticizing pain, of mistaking self-destruction for artistic commitment. But his work stands as an even more powerful monument to the enduring beauty that can be created in spite of that pain. In the end, the music survived. It outlived the artist, the myth, and the long years of silence. The grooves on those old records and the bits of data on a hard drive are no longer haunted by a whisper, but by a voice, clear and true, finally taking its rightful place in the American songbook.